Good afternoon and welcome to More Tea Minister. My name is Ian. Today we are turning to Assam for the first time for our double tea review. It's another in our series A Tale of Two Seasons, and we are looking at teas sold by Kettley. Their website is kettley.in. And we're looking at their 2025 Assam First Flush and their 2025 Assam Summer Gold. So a first flush and a second flush tea from Assam 2025. To be more precise, the estate that these teas have come from is the Latumoni estate, which, although on a small scale, the exact scale of which I've come across differing sets of parameters, it's small scale, but the people who run the estate and produce the tea have very wisely understood that if you can't compete with the big boys on scale and scale of production, then the best thing you can do is to try to do the very best with what you are producing, but also to try and diversify to produce teas that you might not otherwise expect, certainly at such a scale. So it's an estate that works at being organic. I say that because their practices are organic practices, no artificial pesticides or fertilizers, and they use things such as sacrificial plants because they will allow surrounding trees or natural undergrowth to provide those kinds of plants. I've had a couple of teas from Latumoni before in previous harvests, but I've never had a first flush, so I'm very much looking forward to trying these leaves. And then we move on to part two, where we'll take a close look at the teas themselves and then move on to our brewing. So back very soon. Hello and welcome to part two of our video. We are taking a look to begin with at the 2025 Assam Spring Harvest Tea. A reminder that this is from Kettley and it's actually from the Latumoni Tea Estate. So taking a close-up look at these leaves, you can kind of tell that they're Assamica strain leaves. They're fairly slender, but very long. The colour is variations towards the darker end of the spectrum. There's some lovely chestnut brown colour in there. Hopefully you can see them. There's some paler brown. There's some tree bark shades of brown. There's even some slightly green edges, but predominantly this tea has been fairly thoroughly oxidised, and so we have variations in colour along the lines of brown. So now we're going to take a look at the summer harvest tea and see what that looks like. We've now moved on to look at the summer harvest from 2025 from Kettley, the Latumoni Tea Estate offering. Looking at these Assam leaves, the colour scheme is much the same as for the spring harvest. There are some paler specimens, but I'm wondering whether that's an anomaly or a couple of anomalies rather than the usual processing. The leaves don't look particularly different to the spring harvest. I'm just going to take a closer look up at the portion I've got rather than you can see on the screen under a stronger light. I would actually say there are some whole leaves throughout the sample, throughout the whole package, that are much lighter than in the spring harvest. Other than that, these leaves, perhaps again it's an artifact look, slightly more slender, but that's about it. The smell, on the other hand, is very different. There is something of a kind of preserved fruit smell to the summer harvest leaves, whereas the spring harvest leaves have a smell that's sweet and it's fruity and almost hoppy. So apart from these slightly paler specimens of leaves, the real difference is in the smell. So let's move on to part three and brew up these two harvests. Back in a mo. Hello and welcome to part three of our video, part 3A to be precise. We're going to first of all do a Gongfu session to review the Assam 2025 First Flush tea. The vendor is kettley.in, to remind you, and it's from the Latumoni Tea Estate. What's interesting is that kettley.in provides some pretty precise instructions for Western and Gongfu style, and thankfully they're the same for both the First Flush and the second flush, the spring and the summer flush, so that we can use exactly the same parameters and try to iron out any variations on our end, so to speak. So the water is at 90 degrees. It's 2 grams of tea per 50 mils of water, which is what we manage comfortably in this smaller, thicker walled gaiwan. And we start with a 20-second steeping, and then it's 5-second increment. So we'll go 20, 25, 30. And if we have the time or the tea seems to have a lot to give, we might push for a 4th steeping. So to be accurate, to make sure that we compare both teas like for like, or both harvests, so to speak, we're going to use our stopwatch again. So here are our tea leaves in the gaiwan. And I'm just going to move this so I've got a bit of flexibility with what I'm doing, and we will just start. We're aiming for 25 seconds. The leaves don't seem to be floating on the surface. Very slightly hydrated already. That's a very good sign. And then we'll see where that takes us. 18, 19, and 20. There we go. Now, I'm really intrigued to know what this will be like. Ooh. Cocoa. But a sweetened cocoa. That's really interesting. Sweetness and cocoa. And that's about it. Not quite as sweet as white chocolate, but it's that kind of ballpark. Let's put that back there. That's really interesting. Ketley's own tasting note said hazelnuts and chocolate. I'm not quite getting that off the lid, but we'll see what we get. Well, first of all, let's take a look at the colour. A pale gold. There's no green aspect to it, so I would say that's pale gold. Not really sure what I'm picking up from the jug, to be honest with you. A sort of undifferentiated sweetness at the minute. Nowhere near as sort of obvious as it was on the lid. Same with the cup. There's more body on the palate than there is on the nose. Certainly needs a longer steeping. The flavour is falling off. What kind of flavour are we getting so far? Ever so slightly herbal. There's a good amount of body for 20 seconds. Just finish it off. Do you know, I think there is nuts. I'm not picking up cocoa, but I would say something, I think they're spot on with something slightly nutty. So let's reset that, and this time I'm going to go for the leaves. Let me show you. They look to me as if there's a fair bit of rehydrating still to go. Maybe you can see it best with that light rather than that one. But they're by no means fully steeped or fully rehydrated. So this time, 25. And see where this takes us. This is really interesting. It's sort of fulfilling my ambitions for this video channel in the first place, to kind of give me a focus and also to encourage me to try teas that I might otherwise just overlook through no fault of mine or theirs. That's 25 seconds. Even from here, that looks as if the colour is slightly more intense, which is good. The cocoa isn't there, but the nuts are there. I say there was definitely something nutty and very sweet. The colour is definitely more intense. Look at that. That's a real gold colour. That's really bright. once again, it's hard to tell what the smell is from the jug. I'm not actually going to try. I really can't pin it down. Still plenty of flavour. It's lingering on the palate, that kind of nuttiness. Okay, what are we smelling off the cup? The nuts, definitely. Oh, yeah. Slightly bitter and nutty, almost like nuts with the skin still on, put it that way. That's really full-bodied. Wow. That slightly bitter note is actually working rather well. I presume it's something to do with a degree of oxidation coming through, rather than it just coming across as fruit and sweetness. It's giving a slightly... Maybe that's where the chocolate thing is, that's that bitterness. Yes, nuts with a slightly bitter edge, not astringent, not acrid, just slightly bitter, just stopping it from being samey. That's really interesting. So, the leaves are looking more steeped. Perhaps you can see they're looking fatter. That's probably a good word. I'm not sure leaves want to be called fatter, but that's what's happening to them. I don't want to give them a problem with their self-confidence. What am I talking about? So, this one is for 30 seconds. Let's go. One thing I will say is that it's very drying. The flavour is lingering very nicely. Not the bitterness, the kind of nuttiness, but it's very drying on the mouth. I have been drinking some water to stay hydrated, so I can talk more clearly, but definitely rather drying, which is not unpleasant, but that doesn't always happen. There's 30 seconds. And let's see where this takes us. Oh, that's interesting. We seem to have moved away. We seem to have moved away from the straightforward nutty quality. Something a much more complicated sweetness. Perhaps this is where the kind of chocolate aspect comes through. I was thinking it was just that bitterness being a kind of cocoa. That's changed colour again. That's much more yellow. That's a very intense colour. And yet, curiously, the smell here is no more intense than the other two steepings. It only comes across as a mild, undifferentiated fruitiness, and very mild at that. Whereas the taste is getting really, really intense. So let's see where this gets us. That slightly nuttiness, that slightly bitterness that comes from them, that is the skins of nuts, that is. Let's see if I can get something there. Not getting cocoa. I'm getting nuttiness, a slight bitterness, as I say, and some sweetness. It's very interesting, though. I've never had a tea with that kind of real nutty quality to it. So I think we'll leave it at that. There's some slight bitterness starting to pick up on the palate. Not the kind you really want. I think you would want to go for shorter steepings, adjusting the water and adjusting the amount of water in your pot. If you wanted to keep the session going, I wouldn't make the steepings longer. Maybe bump the temperature, but drop the length of time, or maybe just use less water, something like that. But I certainly wouldn't just keep those parameters and upping the time. So Very interesting, nutty, slightly kind of bitter quality, some sweetness in there as well. So let's move on to reviewing the summer harvest. Back in a moment. Hello and welcome to part 3B of our video, where we are going to do a Gongfu session to review the Assam 2025 summer harvest, or the second flush. And as a reminder, this is from the Latumoni tea estate. The parameters are the same as for the first flush. So it's 90 degrees for the water, it's 50 mils of water per steeping, 2 grams of tea, and we begin at 20 seconds and we increase by 5-second increments. So let's make a start. So far, this has been something of a journey of discovery because I really didn't know what to expect from the first flush. I've had Latumoni second flush Assam in the past, but I've never had it as a Gongfu. So I'd be curious to know how the maltiness that you associate with Assam tea actually comes through. And also the kind of rate. Is it intense at the start? Is it something that kind of builds up over time? I'm really interested to find this out. So once again, we're going to time ourselves so that we are comparing like for like per steeping for each harvest. So this one is 20 seconds. There we go. Leaves are fully submerged, which is a good sign. Picking up some colour already. As I say, we're aiming for 20 seconds to start with. And there we go. So how are we doing there? Let's have a see. There's a kind of treacle quality. It's bitter and it's sweet at the same time. It's very intense. That's interesting. No kind of malt as yet. Colour-wise, well, that's already pretty intense, isn't it? It's a very, very intense gold, but with lots and lots of yellow in it. Trying to see it so you can see it for yourself. There we go, that's about right. That's really intense. On the nose, much the same kind of quality, bitter and sweet, kind of treacly. So let's see what we get on the cup and then on our first taste. Much the same, I would say. It's sweet, it's very smooth, it's already very satisfying, and that's only 20 seconds in. There's no bitterness in the sense of astringency. The flavour is lingering. I think a 5-second increment would do it all the favours in terms of increasing the duration of the flavour on the palate. But yes, it's something treacly, it's something bittersweet. There might be something slightly cereally at the edge, but there's no malt as such. So I'm just going to finish that because it's really good. And also kind of remind myself so I can compare it to the second steeping. So let's reset that. This one is 25 seconds. The leaves are definitely plumping up already. And we'll see where that gets us. Yep, thoroughly submerged once again. So we know we're dealing with like for like. I should point out, incidentally, Ketley's own website does stress that the second flush from Latumoni does have that more characteristic malty quality, amongst other flavour aspects. Definitely what you'd associate with a second flush tea from Assam. That's much the same. It's that bittersweet, treacly quality, very intense, but with maybe a bit of fruit thrown in. So that colour's even more intense. Yeah, really gold coloured. Lots of fruit. Well, not fruit, a slight fruitiness, but lots of that kind of sweetness. Still with that slightly bitter edge that makes it quite complex. Funnily enough, that's what I'm picking up off the leaves. There's a slightly astringent note on the leaves. So let's see, along with a lot of sort of treacly sweetness. Let's see what we get here. A very complex sweetness with a bit of bitterness. I think you can start to join the dots at this point. That bitterness is coming across not just as pure bitterness, but it's the tail end of a malty quality, actually. Slightly cereally, so it's bitter, slightly cereal. I think that's maltiness coming through. So I'd be very interested to see what that's like at a third steeping. And let's see where that gets us this time. The flavour's definitely lingering, so we're at the right spot. We're now getting towards the right duration for our steepings. Leaves are getting towards being fully rehydrated. 30 seconds. Not moving around, which is what they tend to do. I'm sure you'll have noticed when they're starting to hydrate, or when they're continuing to hydrate even. So give that a prolonged shugle. I do like using that word. Must make sure I don't use too many Scottish terms though. That's going to be slightly oversteeped because I haven't finished this. So let's get that steeped, poured out as quickly as I can. That's probably an extra 3 seconds. So we'll take that into account. Let's finish this so the cup is available. It's much the same, slightly more intense, and the malt's definitely there. That kind of cereally, dark, sweet taste with the bitterness. The mind joins the dots and says, oh, that's malt. So it's almost as if you're getting the different... Malt is not coming from one particular flavour or one particular molecule even. It's coming from lots of them that are coming out of different steepings, and only collectively are getting the fuller picture. Interestingly, this is going to sound like an odd thing, something that came out on that second one, at least on the leaves, and it's there still. It's going to sound like an odd word, a slightly vinegary note. Doesn't come through on the taste, but almost like something fermented. I'm not saying any of that's coming through, but it must be part of the malt flavour profile. There must be some sort of aspect to it. Slightly fruit, still very intense sweetness with the bitterness. You can see that's a much darker colour. That's a bronze colour. Straight up bronze, I would say. Much the same on the cup. There's the malt. It's not overbrewed either. That's a complete kind of malt. It's gentle, but there's definitely malt there, I would say. So, third steeping brings the malt out. The first two steepings are letting you know the kind of flavour that goes into making a malt. So, let me just draw to a conclusion there. The first flush and the second flush are very different. I'm sorry, that's the cat shaking the camera, and this is the third take as it is. I really don't want to do it again. The first flush and the second flush are very different. The first flush has a kind of nutty quality to it with a slightly bitter edge. Still quite complex, still quite light. The second flush is a classic malty profile, but it's not heavy. Perhaps taking this to maybe one or maybe two more steepings would give you something a little more intense in the malt. But the malt is definitely there. I didn't want to do a Western for either of them because it tends to average out the flavour components, and I wanted to kind of see how distinctive they were. All in all, I have to say I prefer the second one because it's got that gradual revelation of the malty quality. So, they're both enjoyable, but I would say the second one has the edge, but I'm glad I gave it a try. In terms of availability, well, Assam tea is available in lots of places. I've seen First Flush Assam in a few as well. Latumoni despite being scale-wise a kind of boutique tea maker, is relatively available, including some of its more unusual kind of offerings. They've done green tea oolongs in the past. However, it would take a bit of digging to find specifically First Flush. So, a slight proviso, but Assam is available in lots of places, and I'm sure if you Google Assam First Flush, that would help greatly. Although, as always with these cases, if it is possible and you're interested, I would recommend that you go through Kettle It, simply because that seems the courteous thing for me to do. I'm not sponsored by them or anything. It just seems the correct way to behave. So, how easy are these two teas to prepare? Well, I followed the parameters from Ketley and they work. The first steeping, in both cases, the flavour was dropping off. The second one hit the sweet spot in terms of the flavour lingering, and the third one kind of brought out the fuller flavour. Perhaps some slight adjustment, maybe slightly hotter, but keeping the duration but the same for that third steeping might allow the malt to come out sooner by the point you've got to the second one. But there's nothing astringent about that. It's not oversteeped. So you could probably get away with a fourth steep. In fact, what I might do, and it's only a might do a fourth off camera and then put the findings in the description box. If you don't see them, for once, it's not because I've forgotten. It's just that I haven't done it, but I think that might be a worthwhile experiment. Bearing in mind that third steeping was a couple of seconds longer than it should have been, but well worth it. So, 3 out of 3, with the proviso that Assam First Flush isn't as easy to find as Second Flush, and Latumoni, not least because of the scale, is a little bit harder to find. But other than that, a hearty recommendation from me. I really enjoyed learning about Assam First Flush, and I hope it's been of some use and interest to you as well. So it only remains for me to say happy steeping and God bless.